Adesso andiamo a vedere un'altra base importantissima.
Now we're going to see another very important base in pastry. We're going to talk about pan di Spagna, a preparation, a basic dough that we find in a lot of preparations. It is a kind of Italian sponge cake, especially if we think about classical cakes like mimosa cake, charlotte cake, Saint-Honoré cake. So we totally or partially have bases of pan di Spagna, but it is also used in other preparations. Pan di Spagna is a whipped mass that tends to develop a type of leavening that is physical, based on how we trap the molecules of air that we generate through the whipping. We can have a product that has a quite more or less uniform growth. Our main aim is to bring the proteins, especially of the egg whites, to a stage that facilitates their absorption of air. The proteins of the egg white have kind of like a wool ball shape, and at their native stage they are all separated and enveloped in water particles. When we give them a mechanical force, these proteins step to another stage that is called denaturation. During the denaturation, which can be more or less quick depending on the application temperature, these proteins start laying out, rolling out, kind of spreading, favoring the air capturing. If we use a speed that's too elevated, it will be harder for the proteins to contain the great flow of air we're generating. So in the first moment we almost have the perception that it's being quicker, so putting the machine at the maximum speed, but only later we will realize that the mass tends to deflate compared to a whipping at a constant speed. How many ways can we make pan di Spagna? We're talking about insertion method. First of all, we can make a pan di Spagna that is most suitable for a softer structure, a pan di Spagna that can be a little bit more rigid, because maybe we have to make cakes, vertical cakes, especially when we're working with ceremony cakes where we have to put a layer of every layer, so we're working vertically. Or when we make a cake design cake where we need a mass that's more geometrical, linear, and drier, to avoid that when we apply the sugar paste, it tends to dampen during the various stages of preparation. So we can have a light pan di Spagna, a medium one, or a heavy one, based on the proportions of the ingredients that we're going to use, and especially to the preparation method. There are 3 specific methods, basic methods, to assemble pan di Spagna. The first method is the most simple one, which we'll see today. So we're going to insert the eggs, the whole eggs together with the sugar. We're going to let them whip at a medium speed. We're around 6 to 8 minutes of working with this type of machine. Then when the mass has the optimal density to be worked with, we can remove it from the machine, pour the powders from bottom to top, sifted of course, and then we're going to directly insert it in a cake mold. Or we can heat up the eggs with the sugar at a temperature of around 40-45 degrees. We're going to heat the eggs with the sugar, especially when for temperature reasons, because maybe it's very cold, or because the eggs were taken from the fridge, we're going to heat them up to increase the denaturation of the proteins, and so increase the speed of the puffing of the whipped mass. Usually eggs in pastry are kept outside of the fridge, so maybe we don't have an environment that's suitable for the preservation of the eggs outside of the fridge. So it can be done, but only if we have a storage place that's far from the warm preparation area where the temperature is constant. In the contrary, we're going to have to keep the eggs in the fridge. So we're heating up the eggs only when the temperature of our laboratory or of the eggs is too low for our working. The third method, which is a little bit more effective, is to have a separate whipping. So we're going to whip the egg whites in a planetary machine with a little part of sugar. Always remember to never add the sugar in the beginning, but you have to wait for it to get to around 50% of the whipping, because sugar tends to slow down the whipping phase for two main reasons. The first is that sugar in contact with the watery part of the eggs, which are both in egg whites and in yolks, will tend to favor the absorption of the air, and so it can disturb the whipping. Another important thing is that in the first stage, when the sugar is already grainy, it might break the molecules of air that the proteins are trying to fix around them. So it's preferable to always put it a little bit later. So let's whip the egg whites with the sugar, and then we can both whip the egg yolk with the remaining part of the sugar or just add it liquidly. Once the egg whites are ready, we're going to fold in the egg white. If we whipped the egg yolks, we're going to put the egg white in the egg yolk. Why? Because you always have to lighten the hardest and more resistant mass you have. If instead the yolk is going to be put liquid, so not whipped, we can just add it a little at a time directly in the bowl and fold it from bottom to top. And once we assemble the two bases, so egg yolk and egg white, we are going to sift the powders in and fold from bottom to top. In this way I can take advantage of the foaming capacity of the albumins, but at the same time I'm making two passages from bottom to top. First to incorporate egg whites and egg yolk, and then to incorporate the flours. Clearly, with a little bit of training and technique, and once you have your manuality trained, I advise you to use this method. But in this first part in which we are learning and discovering the world of pastry, I advise you to use this simple method, which is a little bit more functional for us. Once you've inserted the powders, sifted of course, into 2 or 3 steps, folding from bottom to top, we're going to put the mass directly in the cake mold. Remember to put a little bit more than a half in a cake mold and to weigh out the quantity of raw mass that you are inserting in the cake mold. This is very important, especially when we have to make more cakes together and cook more cakes together, so that we will have a uniform baking of all of our products. So we will add the raw mass in our cake mold, silicone or aluminum or material that you have available, and then we will start with the cooking part. For all the 3 methods, pan di Spagna cooks at around 180 degrees with a timing of around 25-30 minutes. For every growth product, I always advise you to work in the first stage with a fan that's working at the minimum to avoid that during the first phase in which pan di Spagna has to grow and it doesn't have stability, the fan might, working at high speed, might disturb and thermally pressure the pan di Spagna, might disturb it and favor its swelling and then collapsing. So in the first stage, fan at the minimum, closed valve to favor the steam, so help the pan di Spagna grow. In the second stage, we're going to open the fan to go on with the drying, and when the pan di Spagna has grown and fixed externally, we're going to understand it from the bronzing we have on the surface, we can increase the fan a little bit to improve the distribution of the heat. At the end of the cooking, we can remove the pan di Spagna from the oven. Always remember to unmold it quickly, because at the side of the cake mold, after we've made a Maillard reaction, so we have a browning of the pan di Spagna, it might dampen, so the cake mold might let the pan di Spagna dampen and so form with the sugary part a sort of glue, and we won't be able to unmold it. So after it comes out of the oven, we're just unmolded the product and letting it cool on a rack. to allow the steam that's still present in pan di Spagna to come out both from the upper part and from the base part. After which, once the pan di Spagna is nice and dry, we can clearly use it based on the preparations we have to make. Always remember to not cut the pan di Spagna with So to not cut the pan di Spagna when it's still warm, because it might stick together and let adhere all of the internal part, creating big holes inside. And this is it with the introduction and explanation about pan di Spagna. Here we are in the demonstration part of our pan di Spagna, where we're going to see the main factors with the right outcoming of our base. We're going to insert our eggs in the planetary bowl. Remember what I told you before. We're going to turn on our machine, just like this. This speed, more or less, not too high. Always remember to, even though you're using whole eggs and not egg whites, to let it foam a little bit. And then we can insert progressively the sugar. In the meantime, we're not stopping in general in what we do. We're going to take our sifter, and in this case, in the specific case of pan di Spagna, we're still going to sift the powder directly over the mass, but before we do this, I advise you to sift it once, a couple times, to let it oxygenate and to improve the actual insertion in the mass. So we're going to sift it. We're going to do this a couple times, and then we will work it directly with the internal of the bowl. When you start seeing some foamy phase, we can start adding the sugar fluently, progressively, but not all together. Now, as I was saying, we're going to re-sift the flour once again. So that we make sure that even eventual clumps or residues are completely eliminated. The flour is quite nice and clean. We can see that from what can remain on our sifter. The machine is keeping working, and remember that in this case we've used a cake mold, aluminum cake mold, but we can also use, to cook a pan di Spagna, we can use a silicone mold where the cooking is more enveloping. It's easier to unmold, or we can use directly the ring molds, steel ring molds that we insert directly in our tray. We can put a steel mold, and basically in that case we just don't even need to grease the product too much. Before we assemble, I'm telling you a couple of fundamental things. When you're using a cake mold to cook your pan di Spagna, to be practical, we tend to use products that are cheap, like butter spray. These are products that are highly hydrogenated. They derive from vegetable fat, and if they are put in a cake mold, let's imagine that we're making, for example, a product, it allows us to be much quicker, but the aggression that the butter tends to have on the cake sponge is a lot more amplified, meaning that when we will bake, it's almost as if the spray butter, that's a residue in the perimeter of the cake mold, overheats at very high temperatures, which are going to almost fry the cake. One of the main things that we notice is that the cake completely detaches and reduces completely from the sides of the bowl or the mold, and especially when we taste it and taste if the organoleptic perception is optimal, the product externally will have a strong fried and friable flavor. And so we always advise, if possible, to use a softened butter, 15-16 degrees. Just brush it nicely on the cake mold, and then you're going to add some flour and remove the residues. This is the best absolutely method to have a good product that isolates the cake during the unmolding. So we're almost ready, as you can see. The mass is almost ready. The first indicators that I notice are surely the increase in volume. Another thing I'm noticing is that the eggs from the starting color tends to lighten up. This is for the effect of the volume increase and for the oxidation that the air is doing on the egg. If you have a doubt on the fact that the density is right or not, remember that if you turn off the machine and lift it, you're going to favor the defolding of the product, the unwhipping of the product. So during the mechanical phase, don't ever change speed. Don't lower it, don't increase it, because it's almost as if we were changing the direction of the assembling push. In that case, we might favor it's deflating. From the camera, you can see that in the external part, when it is finishing, it tends to do this. So the external part tends to enter in the central part, stirring. And in the external part, the mass becomes smoother and smoother. This is one indicator that makes me think that we're almost finished. Clearly, we know that the timing is around 6 to 8 minutes, but not all machines work in the same way. It also depends on the type of whisk you're using. Usually when you use fine whisks, it's going to be quicker. So we are done. The very last thing I can say, or I can understand, is I'm only going to have it when I turn off the machine. So turning it off, and from here, remember, lift the arm very gently. Then we're going to take the whisk and we're going to do this. If the mass flows down writing on top of itself, it means that we reached the right correct density to have the second stage now. So now this is probably the hardest part that we have to deal with. We're going to remove the bowl, move away our machine. As I was telling you, there are many schools of thought about the insertion of the flour. We prefer to sift the flour directly over the mass, because if we put the flour with our hands or directly with some oven paper, we mustn't think of flour as if we see it in our hands, so very soft, very light. We don't think about the impact that the flour has on our whipped mass. It might overpower the mass and it might make it deflate. So if we sift it directly over the mass, we're going to lighten up the process and the impact that the flour has on the mass. From here, spatula, and we're going to fold from bottom to top. Remember that it must be a light movement. You never have to change direction, because in that case you're increasing the deflating. And make sure you're mixing the bottom part of the mixture. That's because when we insert the flour like this and we stir, the flour will tend to flow towards the bottom of the bowl, and if we don't mix it thoroughly, we might stimulate the formation of clumps. Just like this. You have to move and stir the bowl with your other hand too, so that you're sure you're assembling right. And more or less we're going to insert the flour into 3 or 4 steps, not to attack the mass too much. So the movement is always the same. If we wanted to obtain a pan di Spagna that's softer compared to the proportions you chose, we advise you to add to the flour a little bit of potato starch. In this case, the starch tends to give more softness, and a little bit of honey that you can add when you're adding the sugars. I put the last part of the flour here. We're going to keep folding. You can notice that even though I've been stirring for a long time, the mass is quite foamy. It hasn't. And you slowly managed to have an optimal result, avoiding to deflating the mass. From here, we're going to quickly insert the product in a buttered cake mold, like this. It almost seems like an ice cream. If it's flowing like this, it means that everything we made was done correctly. Other important thing, never hit the cake mold anyways, just place it over a baking tray. You don't have to level out or even out the surface, because it will anyways spread during the baking. Of course, now we're trying to understand some procedures, but I should have already put the product directly in the oven. The more time passes, the more the air tends to flow towards the surface, and so the whole thing would deflate. So as you put it in the cake mold, at half or 3/4 of the way in the cake mold, again right away in the oven. Remember the important indicators that we talked about, so fan that's not too high in the beginning, 180 degrees, 20-25 minutes. As it comes out of the oven, just unmold it right away and put it on a rack to let it evaporate, and then we can use it in all of the preparations that we need. And this is it with the preparation of pan di Spagna.